A woman mistreated her husband, deceived him, and eventually divorced him. 6 months later, regret started to creep in. If I could give anyone advice about divorce, it would be this: don't separate over minor issues. However, if your spouse is abusive, threatens you, or puts your children in danger, then leaving immediately is the best decision. In my case, though, there was no mistreatment. We spent 8 years together, and for the most part, our relationship was good. We had 4 children. Around 5 years into our marriage, I got promoted at work, and I started feeling like my husband was holding me back, or at the very least, stopping me from achieving greater success and a better life. Financially, we were never well off, but after my promotion, I began earning more than him. My work hours increased, while his were reduced, which meant he spent more time at home. I started feeling intense resentment toward him for staying home and spending time with our children, while I worked late into the night. By the time I got home, the kids were either getting ready for bed or already asleep. A few months after my promotion, it became clear that things at home weren't running smoothly without me. Some nights when I returned, the dishes were unwashed, the kids hadn't eaten, or there was another reason for me to be upset with him. My frustration made no difference. Despite his constant reassurances that he would try harder, it always infuriated me. Over the next few years, the situation only got worse. My work hours didn't decrease, while his remained inconsistent. Sometimes full days, sometimes partial. Due to my job, he couldn't work full-time, yet we still needed extra income. Whenever he mentioned taking on additional hours, I voiced my disapproval. But at the same time, I constantly complained that he wasn't contributing enough financially. If he ever pointed out this contradiction, I would simply tell him to figure it out. I knew it hurt him, so I started saying it frequently, whenever I found an excuse. Over time, I began despising him and pulling away. I knew I was hurting him, but I didn't care. If he didn't want to be in pain, he should have at least made me happy. That was the same justification I used when I started talking to another man. At first, I considered him just a friend, but what began as casual work conversations soon turned into late-night texting, exchanging pictures and videos, and eventually finding excuses to be alone with him. Deep down, I knew it was wrong, but it made me feel alive, something I hadn't felt in years with my husband. I was tired of feeling miserable, so I did it for myself. The worst moment came one evening when I arrived home to find that my husband had cleaned the entire house, prepared dinner for the whole family, and picked a movie for us to watch together. A few years earlier, this would have warmed my heart, but that night, I couldn't even look at him. I pretended to be sick, spending the rest of the night in bed, while he took care of me, checking my temperature, and even preparing a separate meal for me. It made me feel terrible, which only angered me more, because he was the reason I felt that way. By the end of the night, I was texting the other man again. In the months that followed, no matter what my husband did, I found fault in it. His mere presence irritated me. He was heartbroken over how I was treating him, but I kept pushing him to his breaking point, knowing exactly where it would lead. After most arguments, he would apologize for supposedly doing something wrong, even when there was hardly anything to blame him for. I never apologized. I always found a way to make him feel worse. In my mind, I was always right, and he was always wrong. That was all that mattered. Even when he discovered my affair with the man from work, I pretended not to care, even though deep inside, it tore me apart. I saw him struggle to hold back tears, but I refused to show any sympathy. That was the moment I told him I wanted a divorce. I could almost hear his heart breaking. He pleaded, fought through his emotions, and kept saying we could fix everything together. But I had no interest in repairing our marriage. Yet, I ended things with the other man, knowing I could go back to him anytime I wanted. I saw my husband try to mend things, and occasionally I acknowledged his efforts. But most of the time, I continued being cruel, picking at every little thing. I don't know what else he could have done to make me happy. Maybe finding a job that paid so much that I wouldn't have to work at all. He said he was looking for such a job, but searching and securing one are two completely different things. Around that time, I started browsing the internet, reading similar stories and sharing my own. The more I engaged, the more validation I received that I was in the right. A whole online community reassured me that he was a terrible husband. I began saying hateful things to him and openly ignoring his presence. Convinced that I was justified, I contacted a lawyer and within weeks filed for divorce. Finally, it was over. The process went relatively smoothly. My husband didn't ask for much, except for one thing. He begged me not to go through with the divorce and to try to work things out, but I had no desire for reconciliation. He was broken, while I felt free. I could do whatever I wanted, without guilt or responsibility. It was an exhilarating sense of liberation, but it didn't last long. Within the first month after he moved out, I missed trash day 3 times. The kitchen was rarely stocked with clean dishes, and the laundry piled up so much that I resorted to sniff tests to check if clothes were still wearable. Worst of all, I had never seen my children so unhappy. My eldest daughter had seen some messages from the other man months earlier and knew that my ex-husband still wanted to repair our marriage. Before long, she stopped talking to me, only speaking when she wanted to visit her dad. The other children also began expressing their wish to live with him. I tried my hardest to keep them happy, but in the end, all I did was buy them toys, temporary distractions that brought only brief moments of joy. I was also struggling terribly at work. Being on my own, I couldn't put in all the extra hours that were expected of me. Eventually, I gave in and started calling my ex-husband to watch the kids. He always arrived as soon as he could and never failed to ask if I needed anything when I returned. When I got home, I would find the dishes cleaned, the laundry done, and sometimes even dinner prepared. He never lingered, barely spoke to me, and would simply say to call him if I needed help before leaving. One evening, he even took out the trash and set it by the curb because it was trash day, and once again I had forgotten. He always looked so heartbroken when he left. After a couple of months, my friends encouraged me to go on a date. It was supposed to be a simple dinner and a movie. I felt excited and hopeful, but during dinner, an overwhelming wave of guilt hit me. The feeling was so strong that I skipped the movie altogether. A week later, after shedding countless tears, I found myself sitting on a therapist's couch. I told her everything, starting from my promotion at work. She disagreed with me and questioned the justifications I had found online that supported my decision to divorce. I started seeing her 2, sometimes 3, times a week. The more I tried to prove that I had been right, the more I realized just how wrong I had been. It was truly heartbreaking. I cried more in her office during that first month than I had in my entire life. After spending nearly $2,000 on therapy, I finally understood that while my ex-husband had his flaws, mine were far worse. I had done and said so many cruel things that, looking back, I wouldn't even want to be around someone like me. And yet, he had wanted to be with me. I still remember the meeting with the lawyer when he begged me not to go through with it. But I went ahead anyway, and afterward, I even bragged online about how freeing it felt. I was so terribly mistaken, and now I finally see it. A few weeks ago, as he was leaving after watching the kids, I walked out with him and asked if he would consider coming back. He looked at me, his eyes filling with tears, and a few rolled down his cheeks. He said he didn't know if he could. He told me the pain had lasted too long, had been too unbearable, and he was afraid that if we got back together, I would just hurt him all over again. He had always believed that I would eventually realize how much he loved me and stop before signing the divorce papers. But the thing that wounded him the most was when I signed them and then took a deep breath of relief. That moment shattered him more than anything else. Now, he isn't sure if he will ever be able to trust me again. I don't blame him. I destroyed a man who, in hindsight, was a wonderful husband. I robbed my children of an incredible father. A great father lost his kids. I had been chasing freedom, expecting happiness. But instead, I now spend all my free time either sitting alone at home or in my therapist's office. Please listen to me instead of believing the internet's glorified portrayals of divorce. If your marriage is struggling, take a deep, honest look at yourself first and consider whether there is something you can change. This advice applies to both men and women. Divorce doesn't lead to happiness, and life after divorce doesn't bring joy either. Watching your husband and children suffer because of your choices is the most excruciating experience I have ever endured.